Hello, good afternoon. This is Lucas Coffier from Tokyo. It's 10 p.m. of June 18th. We're today in touch, of course, with colleagues from Brussels, Eva, and with our speaker that I'm going to introduce in a second, that is in California, where is exactly 6 a.m. So we're connecting three continents. And I would like, of course, to thank especially our speaker today more than usual because of the timing. But we will do that in a second. Let me first do a little bit of homework and introduce you, for those that don't know me and don't know the help desk, the EU-Japan Technology Transfer Help Desk, which is a service of the EU-Japan Center for Industrial Cooperation. This is a slide giving you a little bit of information about me and us. As you can see, my name, my email, if you want to be in touch, please do. If you have any questions that might be related to technology transfer in Japan or Europe. And you also have a link to our website, a link to the survey that we always run continuously for SMEs that are interested in technology transfer practices. And of course, if you are interested in knowing more about what we do, please do register to the newsletter that you see here as the last URL. Today, we are starting the webinar number 35, and the title is Growing Strong Brands, Valuation Lessons Learned from Industry Leaders. Today's speaker is Efrat Kaznik. Good morning, Efrat.
Good morning.
Good morning. Let me just provide to the audience a very short bio of you. Efrat, first of all, is a very good friend of mine, and that's why she's here at 6 a.m., as you can imagine. But also, Efrat is the president of Foresight Valuation Group, and she's a lecturer at Stanford Graduate School of Business. Efrat is a Silicon Valley-based valuation and intellectual property expert with more than 2 decades of consulting experience, focusing on assisting IP holders across industries with the creation, commercialization, and monetization of their intangible assets. Efrat is helping clients ranging in size from Fortune 100 companies to startups with IP and business valuations in support of licensing deals, IP and technology acquisitions, M&A transactions, financial reporting, strategic planning, and fundraising. She frequently serves as a testifying expert in disputes involving IP and startup valuations and damages. Efrat also served as chair at the high-tech sector LES USA Canada and has been recognized as one of the top IP strategists in the world by IAM every year since 2013. There are many other things to say about Efrat, but I don't want to steal her time. So Efrat, again, welcome. Thank you again for being with us at 6 a.m. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luca. I hope everybody can hear me. Good morning. Can you hear me okay before I go into the long discussion? Okay. Thank you, Lucas. Thank you, Eva. Thank you to the EU-Japan Center for Industrial Cooperation for inviting me to speak. I've given a few webinars before to this fine organization at this time, so it's not a problem for me at all. Actually, I'm kind of an early riser, so that's all good. Today, we're going to speak about brands, which, if you've attended any of my previous presentations, usually talk about patents and or valuation of IP that's related to technology in the context of startups or in the context of a larger company, as Luca mentioned from my background that you can also see on this slide. I've been doing IP valuations for about 25 years. Foresight Valuation Group is the current company that I founded about 10 years ago. I'm also lecturing at Stanford, so I'm teaching a lot of this to people at the business school as well as all over the world. I'm very active with LES, Licensing Executive Society. There's another organization that is more active in brands, which is called INTA, which is not on my slide since I'm not very active there, but I recommend that people check out if you're interested in brands, and I can provide those names later after the webinar. I should also mention that my slides are going to be available and distributed by the organizers after the webinar is over, so there's no need to take screen pictures or write copious notes. I mean, you're welcome to write notes, but just just know that the webinar, I guess the recording as well, are going to be available as well as the slides. With that, I would like to get started. So I should also mention I'm going to touch on a few legal definitions and topics. Part of what underlies a brand are legal rights. I should mention that I'm not a lawyer, and nothing in this presentation should be construed as legal advice. Also not attempting to represent a correct legal picture of IP rights in any of the regions that people are calling from. A lot of my legal insights, to the extent I give them, are going to be based in the U.S. Based on, and I'll when I go over that, I'm going to mention, to the extent I know how things are done in Europe or in Japan, I would mention that. But just keep in mind that anything legal that you see, and it's not going to be a lot of it because the focus is going to be economic. Anything legal is based on U.S., kind of the legal landscape in the U.S., so just keep that in mind. So for the outline today, we're going to start with a definition. What is a brand? We're going to touch on the IP protections associated with brands, as I mentioned, from a U.S. perspective. We're going to continue into the brand valuation models. So valuation is kind of the heart of this presentation. I'm a numbers person. I like to value what I can. That's why people come to me, and my work with my clients, as well as any teaching that I do, I usually talk about valuation. So we'll get to that. We'll even do a case study if we have time. And finally, it's kind of expected now to talk about the COVID-19. I hope everybody on the line is doing fine and is healthy. Obviously you are, you wouldn't be calling in. I know Europe particularly was hit a little harder than anywhere else. I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact of COVID-19 to the extent there is, just a few insights. Again, I'm asked this question a lot. I'm actually giving another webinar tomorrow about the impact of COVID-19 on startup valuations. I think it might be a little too early to say with this, but there are some specific things we're seeing about brands. We're seeing some bankruptcies, for example, that involve, some iconic brands. So I wanted just to say a few words about that, and then we'll end with key takeaways. So let's get started. So what is a brand? So in terms of definitions, okay, so kind of the definition of a brand, and this is taken from the ISO, which is an international standard organization standard on brand valuation, which exists. There aren't that many that you can find in the topic of IP valuation, so I would encourage you to check this standard. It has some straightforward guidelines on how to value brands. I'll get to the valuation part of the talk, so I'm going to say a few things about how valuations are done and what are the guidelines and where we take them from. It really depends on what you do the valuation for, but in this case, this is kind of a general standard that is useful as a reference point, and I recommend it. You can download it from the ISO, I think, for a small payment. It's kind of an international organization. Anyways, they put together a brand valuation standard in 2010 and then supplemented that with another standard that I'll get to. It's in one of my slides. The way a brand is defined is it's an intangible asset, so it's a form of intellectual property that includes but is not limited to names, terms, signs, symbols, logos, designs, and a combination of these, intended to identify the goods, services, or entities, or a combination of these, creating distinctive images and associations in the minds of stakeholders. And this is really important. And this is really what separates a brand from a trademark. We're going to talk about trademarks in a minute, but I just wanted to show two pictures of that anybody would immediately recognize of some of the most iconic brands out there, just to show how the combination of the picture, the name, the tagline, for Apple, think different, for Nike, just do it, and kind of the whole combination of everything creates some sort of association. Excellent product design, for example, when it comes to Apple, or Nike, excellence in athletics. Whatever it is, it's more than just the collection of symbols and logos. It's the whole feeling and association that makes a trademark a brand. And we're going to talk about that. The next thing I want to show is, so in terms of valuation, it is not easy to find values of brands. They are not reported on financial statements. That is an issue that is true for all intangible assets, not just brands. Tangible assets are not reported on the financial statements of the companies that created them. That sometimes comes as a shock to some people, but if you've heard any of my previous talks, or if you know anything about accounting, you know that's true for all accounting standards, whether in the U.S., a U.S. GAAP, or IFRS in the U.S., in Europe. So in order to know the value of a brand, there's a few places you can go. This is one place. So this company called Interbrand is a UK-based company. They've been issuing these brand rankings. They have their own proprietary methodology that looks at a lot of different things like R&D spending and market share of the stock in the market and things like that. I don't know their formula, so I don't want to represent it, but that's kind of my understanding of what they do. And they create this ranking, and the nice thing about it, you actually have a dollar value attached to a brand. So you can see Apple number one, the market they assigned, the value they assigned to the Apple brand in 2019 is $234,241,000. And the plus 9% shows the increase and or decrease from last year. So you can see, this is just a slice of a screenshot that I grabbed. There's a whole list of, they show the top 100 or 200, and then you can drill down further. I guess you pay them. So on their website, you'll see the top 100 usually. And it's just an interesting combination of companies. You see a good mix of automotive, luxury brands, consumer electronics, Apple and Samsung, hardware, Intel, which we'll talk about later on, beverages, Pepsi and Coke, entertainment, Disney. So it's kind of, and obviously technology, like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, all the usual suspects. So it's interesting. The reason I'm showing this slide is just to show that there's really a good crossover of industries that are utilizing strong brands for their operation. People tend to think that brands are unique to business to consumers, that direct to consumer industries, which is generally true. But what we're seeing more and more is you see like the B2B, the business to business, and Intel is the best example of that. And if you're familiar with the Intel inside story that we'll get to in a minute, is a company that's selling to businesses and yet has made a big branding effort to differentiate its brand from other chip manufacturers. And you can see other companies here, SAP, GE. You see a lot of companies that are not necessarily only direct to consumers or the luxury brands, and yet have strong brands. So let's keep that in mind as we go through the presentation. The next topic I want to touch on is the topic of IP protection. And I'll repeat the caveat that I'm not a lawyer, and with that, we're going to jump into this is kind of a straightforward model that I always show my students at Stanford when I start talking about IP. On day one, I teach a class at the business school, and I teach IP management and valuation to business people. So Anything I'm showing you that's legal is supposed to kind of make sense to the business people as well. So the interesting thing here is on the left, you'll see kind of the main bucket of intangible assets. So in a company, let's think about a software company where this example is taken from. You have technology, obviously, the software. You have data, which is kind of a new asset that's coming up, and I'm giving a lot of talks about data, and actually I made this slide to show the data part of things, but today we're talking about brand. And then you have brand, which is kind of a bucket that covers all the marketing-related assets. On the right-hand side, we're seeing the type of IP rights, and these are kind of global in scope. Again, this is a U.S. perspective, but you can find pretty much the similar 4 buckets everywhere else in the world. And what you're seeing here is you're kind of seeing what protection covers what asset. And, you know, technology obviously is covered by patents, trade secrets, copyright. Data is really not covered by patents, but other things. But let's talk about brands. That's the topic of today. So brands are covered by, first and foremost, trade secrets. So we're going to talk about trade secrets a little bit. But since brand is wider, broader than just a trade secret, there's also other protections in the company that cover other aspects of the brand. For example, copyright. So if you have anything written, any materials that you consider part of your brand, supporting your brand, supporting your marketing message, those could be protected by copyright, any videos, anything like that. As well as trade secrets. So trade secrets are any information that you think brings value to your company and you keep secret is a trade secret. And some of that can be related to your brand, and I'm sure Apple has a lot of that in their coffers that, you know things about your customer, that kind of the know-how that goes with how you sell your product. That I consider that also part of your brand. So just keep in mind that the brand is much, from an IP protection, is much broader than just trademarks. With that, I would like to actually switch to talking about trademarks. Again, so this is a general table talking about IP rights, and you can see here that we have the 4 buckets that I just mentioned. And when it comes to trademarks, the definition is kind of similar to that of the brand in that it covers word, name, symbol, device used to trade to distinguish goods. So it's anything that distinguishes your goods in the marketplace. A brand can be registered or unregistered. You don't have to register a brand to have a brand, but you have to use it. And that's the common law. Or you can register it in the U.S., for example, from a federal perspective. If you register it, then it'll be protected anywhere, as opposed to a state protection. This is very U.S. specific, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. The nice thing about a brand, it doesn't really expire, or a trademark, it doesn't really expire as long as you use it. If you stop using it and you stop using it for a long time and somebody else starts using it, then you may have lost your brand. It depends if it's registered or not, so that's really getting into a legal question. But kind of the best practice from that is if you have a brand that you care about, you should not only invest in it and develop it and market it, but also use it. Otherwise, you may lose it. Okay. Okay. The next slide has a little more information about trademark protection. In some of that is specific to the U.S. Again, what a trademark does for you, it allows you to affix a mark to your product. So you can use it to advertise your product. And the important thing is that you can go for infringement, which is legal litigation term. If somebody is infringing, which means if somebody is using your brand or your trademark without your permission, you can go after them in court. Then you have to show something that is called the likelihood of confusion. So it's not enough that somebody uses your name. So let's take my name, for example, Forsyth. This is a very generic name, actually. So I'm doing IP valuation. So I use foresight in the context of IP valuation. But if somebody uses the name foresight, which is widely used in other places, to brand, I don't know, real estate services or something like that, which I've seen, then there's really no infringement here because there's no likelihood of confusion between what I'm doing and what they're doing. If you take the name Apple, not that I recommend that you do it, and try to brand something that has nothing to do with the Apple product, you may or may not run into Apple. It depends on what their brand is registered on or what their trademark is registered on. So the likelihood of confusion is important. The advantages of the trademark registration. So, we always recommend that you register your trademark if you can. Again, you're not so much depending on the first usage in commerce, which is kind of the common law protection, which if you don't have registration, but you're the first one to use it, then it's yours. But if it's registered, there's no questions about who owns it. In the US, it gives you nationwide protection, and in the EU, it's a little different. It usually goes through the patent office. So the patent office in every country, and I checked also in Japan, is the one dealing with trademarks. So it's usually the patent and trademark office, which means that unlike some other IP rights, like trade secrets, for example, this is the kind of IP right that requires a registration, and it also goes through an examination process. So they make sure that and you go into the searchable database, which means that anybody else that wants to apply to this trademark your trademark is going to stand in the way of them doing that. So that's kind of the advantage of registering your trademark. Okay. Enough legal. We're back to the fun stuff. So hopefully I haven't lost you. I think most everybody's still on the line. So this is an interesting slide because now we're beginning to talk about how do you pick a trademark. And this is kind of it's a partly legal but also partly practical ways to choose a mark, a name that describes your product in a certain way. And as you can see, we're going from left to right, from the stronger to the weaker. So the strongest, as it's widely agreed upon, a type of trademarks are what we call the fanciful marks, which are names that are made-up names, like Exxon, that have no relation to the goods being described. Okay, so it's a petroleum product, but the name Exxon again has gotten a strong foothold because somebody invested a lot in the branding of this name. But is a strong mark in that it doesn't describe your product. It's a made-up name. The next one in order of strength is the arbitrary mark, and Apple is the best example. So these are words that are existing words. So it's not a made-up name, but they don't necessarily describe what you're selling. And if you manage to make a name like that stick, then you have a pretty strong trademark. Next one is the suggestive marks. And these are words that suggest the meaning or relation, but don't describe the goods. So Microsoft, okay? So it's software for microcomputers, right? So it kind of describes the product, but not like spray and wash, right? Which is the next one down. So the next one down is a descriptive mark. And descriptive mark is a mark that describes either the goods or the services exactly. So spray and wash, there's no hesitation to understand what this thing does. At the same time, doesn't make it a very strong trademark. And understanding is that the trademarks are what supports your brand. That's kind of the inference that we draw from that. The last one is the generic brand. This is the worst thing that can happen to your brand. And this is when your brand becomes a verb. Think about the zipper is the best example. If your brand becomes a verb, you have lost your brand because at that point, it no longer differentiates your product in the market. And the next slide, we have some examples of brands that, and we call that genericized. So the genericized trademarks, there's a whole list on the left. And on the right, you see companies that actually went through court battles to not lose their trademark because of genericization. You can think about Xerox or Band-Aid, or these are names that almost became a verb. So what the company is doing is you have to engage. If you get to a point where your trademark almost becomes a verb, you have to put some concrete effort into what is called policing. You have to police your brand to make sure that it does not become a verb. And one example here in my next slide is this is an ad by Xerox. And so people tend to think it's a good thing if your trademark or brand becomes a verb describing the activity, but it's actually not a good thing because it then loses its distinctive definition as a trademark, which is something that differentiates your product. So as you can see here, this ad, Xerox is almost begging people to not use Xerox as a verb, and they tell you the story about Zipper and what happened to them. So this is something to keep in mind as we talk about managing trademarks or managing brands. To stay strong, this is an important thing that I thought I should mention. Okay, the next, now we're diving into valuation, and I'm going to, try to make it less technical and more business oriented as I can. It's always hard to talk about valuation and numbers on a webinar where I have no interaction with the audience. So hopefully this will all make sense. But so the question is now, so I've shown you kind of what a brand is, what a trademark is, and we talked about Interbrand and the fact that the values of brands are not readily available. So if you did want to go through an exercise of valuing a brand, what would you do? The first thing that I would argue, and I argue that for every type of intangible that I value, and that's what I do for a living, is you really need to understand how does this intangible, in our case the brand, bring value to your company. And what I have here are a few examples of kind of the most common ways that brands can bring value. On the upper right, we have the Intel Inside example. So what happened with Intel, as you saw, is now ranked very high on the Interbrand list of brands. It was actually number 13 this year with a value of $40 billion, just a brand. But back in the 90s, nobody knew what Intel was. If you're not, the consumer didn't know. If you were the OEM, the PC maker, you obviously knew who Intel was, but the consumers didn't know. And Intel felt that it was important for the consumers to know the Intel name so that it would increase the sales of machines or PCs using Intel. And they put, it's one of the most brilliant branding and marketing campaigns ever launched, the Intel Inside. And now everybody knows the Intel name, and you actually look for an Intel chip in a product that you buy to make sure that it's kind of a seal of quality. But, back in like 20 years ago, the name Intel or the brand Intel was not as well known to consumers as it is today. And so this is an example of somebody creating a brand or investing in a brand to create additional market share. On the right is the premium pricing, which is kind of what most people think about when they think about consumer or luxury goods in the context of brands. And the Gucci bags, we don't even have to say, you can immediately recognize the iconic colors, which is kind of what makes a trademark into a brand. It's not just the name, it's the whole look and feel, it's the colors, it's the look of the bag. And that pretty much allows you to take a bag, you make it anywhere you make it. Don't want to say specific countries, and put a logo on it and sell it for 10x the price of the next bag. And that's kind of the most common thing when people think about brands. What they think about is kind of luxury goods and consumer goods. Moving on to the lower left side, which is the Nike swoosh, which is one of, again, most iconic brands and symbols known all around the world. And again, how does this brand bring value? It brings value in many ways. I would also argue premium pricing and additional market share, but also licensing. So one of the things that a good brand can help you with is, and I'll talk about product extensions in a minute, but a licensing is a little different from a product extension. A licensing is a way to let other people use your brand on their products, okay? And you see that in merchandising, athletics, Nike, Adidas, all of these athletic brands and logos are widely using this strategy, as well as companies like Disney, and in entertainment you see that. Merchandising is kind of a big business. Lastly, product extensions. This one I find the most interesting. Really, that is really, to me, the hallmark of a very strong brand. So think about Apple. What did Apple do? They took their very strong brand and created what for them was a new category of product, what for the world was a new category of product, as a smartphone, and use their brand to support that. So if you think about product extensions, think about Apple as the most obvious example of that, and how if you have a strong brand, you can take the name or the whole association that the brand brings and extend it to create new lines of products. And that is really, in my mind, kind of the epitome of having a very strong brand. So these are all examples of how a brand brings value, and that takes us into valuation. I wanted to mention this ISO standard, which I think is a good place to go. So a lot of times when you do valuation of IP or other intangibles, you do that for a certain purpose. So I would do valuations for tax reporting or for financial reporting. Those valuations are governed by specific regulatory requirements that are not necessarily relevant to the audience on the webinar today, because I'm assuming most of you are not accountants or tax professionals. Maybe you are. But anyways, this ISO standard or the two standards are kind of a good reference point. So it's kind of a general standard that anyone can apply. And they actually have two standards. One is the brand valuation, and one is the brand evaluation. The ISO 20671 is the brand evaluation that goes more into evaluating kind of the quality of the brand. And the ISO 10668, the brand valuation, is the one that goes into kind of the monetary financial calculation of how you value a brand. So I put it up there as a reference point for anyone on the call who's interested in following up more deeply into the topic. So when we talk about valuation approaches, that's true for a brand, that's true for any intangible asset, really. There's really three ways or three approaches that you can value an intangible assets, and pretty much any asset. This is also true for tangible assets. The names might be a little different, but the same idea. The first one is the income approach, which is the one I'm going to talk about mostly today. The income approach is a measurement of value that's based on the net present value of future economic benefits, future cash flows. It's a discounted cash flow calculation to the finance people on the call, and to anybody else. It's pretty much taking future cash flows and discounting them, bringing them to the value today. And the future cash flows are the economic benefits that the brand brings you, be it premium pricing, market share, all the things that I showed. The next one is the market approach. The market approach, think about real estate, that's always the analogy that I give, is usually the preferred approach if you can find comparable transactions. It's not always the case with intangible assets that you can find comparable transactions. I do a lot of patent valuations. In the world of patents, finding comparables is not easy. I would argue the same thing here. You may read about a brand changing hands. Even if you do, or if you find information, that the price is not always going to be disclosed. So there's a lot of limitations to applying the market approach. If you think of the world of real estate, you have perfect information. Not so with intangibles, but to the extent you can find any data, I would argue that you could use that. The last one is the cost approach. I'm going to show an example later in a later slide when we use the cost approach. I would say that generally speaking, in the valuation of intangibles, the cost approach is the last one you get to. So if you can do a good income approach, kind of future cash flows or market comparable, you don't necessarily have to get to the cost approach. The cost approach is dealing with either the historical cost of creating an asset, a brand, would be, in the case of a brand, there would be marketing costs. So if you think about a company, there's two types of costs going to sell products. There's sales and there's marketing. The marketing component is what goes to create the brand. The sales is more kind of the tactical closing of a deal that's not part of the value of a brand. But if you wanted to figure out the value of a brand, just one kind of shortcut to doing that is look at the marketing cost if you don't know anything else, how much has been invested in marketing over the years. And with certain adjustments, but that's kind of the cost approach that I'm alluding to. And you can also, if you don't have historical data, you can look at what would it take somebody today, that's the cost to recreate or the cost to reproduce, an equivalent of the brand in cost. So how much would you have to invest in marketing? And that's the cost approach. So next, I wanted to run through a quick case study that this is an actual case that we worked on. And I want to show the two approaches side by side so you have some flavor of the numbers. So the case here was that Company A, I can't share names. Our projects are always very confidential, but we'll call them Company A and Company B. So Company A is doing an asset sale to Company B. So they're selling all of their assets, including their manufacturing facilities and everything. It's a robotics company. Part of what they sold is the name. So they sold the brand. So they sold all the trademarks and the right to brand a product using their name. So everything that has to do with all the brand assets have been sold with the sale of the assets. Company B plans a new line of robotic products, and they're going to brand it using the newly acquired brand. So they don't have a brand they had a brand of their own, but it's not very strong. So they're using this brand, which kind of makes the valuation exercise easy, because if you know exactly how they plan to use the brand, then they attach it to a product, then it kind of makes the valuation a little easier. So what is the value of the brand? So we use two approaches here. One is the cost approach that I told you about, historical marketing costs, because the company selling the brand had a history of marketing, heavy investment in marketing. There was no balance sheet to look at. As I told you, the brands don't show on the balance sheet of the seller. So we either did a cost approach, we also did an income approach, an approach called a relief from royalty that I'm going to explain, which is one of the most common valuation methods for any intangible, also for patents, but also for brands. That is based on the saving in licensing for the buying company. So in terms of the cost approach, so let me just go over the two approaches quickly. So this is a screenshot, no names here, from our calculations. So when you talk about relief from royalty, which is kind of our main approach. So our main approach was the income approach. As I mentioned to you, it's kind of what you try to do if you can. And then we supplemented that with the cost approach. So the income approach, it might be a little small here, but you'll get the slide so you can blow it up on your screen. You start from the projected revenues that are going to utilize the brand, and then you figure out what is the royalty rate in the market for similar brands or trademarks and/or that are being licensed in that specific industry. And there's sources for that you can find, the databases, and I'm happy to send a few names around after the call. We figured out a royalty rate of 8%. We applied it to the sales. And this is the savings in royalties. And that's what this is called the relief from royalties. So the company that's buying the brand if they didn't buy the brand, they would have had to license it from that company or from a similar company, and it would have cost them 8% for every dollar of sales that they're having. So the royalty savings are, the line that you see there, 360,000, 821,000, and so forth and so on. We calculated, since brands, if this was a patent, there would be a termination after a few years, but this is a brand which has an infinite life. So we run the first 5 years, so 2025, and then you see the last column says terminal, which, again, if you're familiar with financial calculations, this is a terminal value, so it's taking the last year pretty much out to infinity using a financial formula. So if you go down, there's a discount rate, which kind of brings the numbers to net present value. So the net present value of the years 2021 to 2025 plus the terminal value is 15.34 million. And then we calculate taxes. These calculations are always done on an after-tax basis, and this is using the US tax rate. The tax adjustment is 3.8 million, and the overall value is 11.6 million. So this is a typical relief from royalty calculation for this brand. What we also did was, since we had the data, was the cost, the historical cost. And so what you look for, if you do an income approach model and you do a cost approach, if the brand has any value, I would usually look for the cost to be lower than the income, which is kind of what we're seeing here. It's kind of in the same ballpark. We had 11.6, 9.6, so it's kind of supporting it, but it's a little lower, which is kind of what I would expect to find. But really, if you look at this company and you kind of aggregate the marketing costs over the years, it has been supporting that they went to this brand, you end with a number that's 9.6 million, and we did a few adjustments to that. So, so this is the other approach to valuation. It's a valid approach. It's just that if you can do something else, you do something else. Which is what we did. So we did an income approach here, and then we did a cost approach. So this is implementation in real life of the valuation approaches. The last thing I want to touch on, just throw in a few remarks, is the impact of COVID-19 on brands. So what you're seeing headlines like that. For example, Hertz, an iconic brand in the US, a company that has been in business over 100 years, is filing for bankruptcy. And other brands, like a lot of these are retail brands that you may or may not be familiar with in the US. JCPenney, J. Crew, Neiman Marcus, you've probably heard about, Gold's Gym, which is an exercise gym, Pier 1, which is a store, a store for homeware goods, and a newspaper chain. A lot of these have gone under, and a lot of it is attributed to the COVID-19 situation. So I wanted to say a few words about that. You look at a company like Hertz, you could have predicted the bankruptcy without, that really has very little to do with the brand. So what I'm trying to say is, when you see a story like that, the fact that a company like that is going under doesn't mean that the brand has no value. What it usually means is that the company's capital structure is very heavily burdened with debt. So a lot of these companies are going under because they can't, the bankruptcy technically means that you can't service your debt. So you can't make your loan payments, and your creditors are taking over your assets. That's the meaning of bankruptcy. But a lot of times, I'm on to the next slide, what I'm saying is the pandemic is only a catalyst for the decline of a business that otherwise was not a healthy business. So a lot of these, it's kind of the last push that the pandemic gave them. And a lot of these are usually overly burdened with debt. So now we're, again, this is my opinion. The brands in COVID-19 affected industries, things like hospitality, travel, and entertainment, the things that took the most heat. May suffer a temporary setback, but in my opinion, as the underlying products are beginning to be sold again, if the brand is strong, it'll rebound. So if you see something going into bankruptcy, it usually means that it was in a bad situation before the pandemic. Nothing would go into bankruptcy in 3 months just because of the pandemic, usually. In terms of an iconic brand, I mean, or any brand. So the key to retaining the brand value. So what is the key to retaining the brand value post-COVID-19? Is to look at the product extensions and licensing opportunities to go outside one's core business. So that's why I showed you this picture of how a brand brings value. And if you think about it, if your core product took a hit due to the pandemic, if you have a strong brand that you can extend into other services, as some of the restaurants did, or some of the travel companies did, a lot of different things, then you can sustain, weather the storm, and emerge on the other end with your brand still strong. Also, I should just make one comment that it's also critical to manage a brand to retain customer loyalty. So stay in touch with your customers. So don't disappear. Keep investing in marketing and promotion, even though you're not selling. So don't just stop investing and carrying the message and then hope that people will remember you in 3 months or 6 months or a year, or as long as it takes. Show awareness of social causes. So that's been going on. A lot of different things going on. Whatever your message is, just make sure that it's heard and your customers know that you care, and just keep in touch with them. So don't disappear, I guess, is the big message here. And with that, I just want to wrap up and open it up for questions. So what we covered today, I have them all on one screen, kind of some of the best practices for managing your trash, I should say brand. Sorry for the title is wrong. That's the last slide I did last night, so you can see that. So managing your brand. So grow a trademark into a powerful brand. Again, we gave some good best practices of how to avoid descriptive trademarks and how to avoiding your trademark becomes genericized. Brands can bring value in several ways: market share, premium pricing, brand licensing, or product extensions. And we gave some examples that anyone recognizes in the market. I pointed out the ISO 10668 standard for guidelines on brand valuation. That's something that's easily, you can easily find. There's 3 valuation approaches: the income approach, which is the most common one; the market approach, when data is available; and the cost approach, which is the least common, but is useful if you have nothing else. And then we talked a little bit about what the pandemic brought about for brands, and my message here is that the key to brands surviving COVID-19 is creating additional brand monetization options and also retain customer loyalty and brand awareness. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Luca and open it up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Efrat. As usual, very precise and clear, despite the time. For you, I would leave maybe a minute to the audience, and also I would like to thank especially those that are with us from Japan, because like me, it's almost 11 p.m. So extra round of applause for you.
Thank you.
I do have I do have a question, maybe a couple of questions for you. While someone maybe in the audience might be interested in writing also something. You brought an example of an acquisition when the buyer kept the original brand, and so I was wondering how the brands usually treated in acquisitions.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So in acquisitions, usually you have a few options. Either keep the brand of for the products that you bring in. You either keep the brand, or you rebrand it under your name, or you create a whole new brand from scratch to describe it. Or you drop the products altogether, which also happens sometimes. So I would say that, and I wrote an article about it a few years ago about, I would say 40% of the acquisitions. So in most cases, the product would take the name of the buying company, you know, it kind of depends on it's usually the case of which brand is strongest for the product that you're trying to protect. And so there's a decision to be made. It's not automatically that you revert to the brand of the buyer. So in the example that I brought, the brand that they purchased was more valuable for the product they were selling than their own brand. So they use that, but it could go either way. So yeah, these are the choices.
Understood. I can see that we had a question, but it was more related to the availability of the presentation. Yes, as Eva said, it will be available. It will be on the website, downloadable, and also Eva will send out an email in a couple of days with the recording, and it will be uploaded on the YouTube channel that we have. Of course. I do have, I don't know, I will leave still maybe a minute for someone if there is any questions, but in the meantime, I do have some other questions for you, Efrat. So I was wondering
Okay.
if there are, if brands are, I mean, more important in some industries than others, because, I mean, we saw some slides with all these brands in luxury goods and consumer electronics. I was wondering if there are any differences, and also you talk about the impact of COVID, but in general about bankruptcy. So if there are any cases of brands that successfully emerged from bankruptcy cases.
Okay, yes, so I'm going back to that slide that we saw, and yeah, as you can see, so as I mentioned, I would say industry-wise, I mean, we don't see a lot of life sciences here, and we wouldn't. So if to the extent you see life sciences brands, it's usually going to be associated with either pharmaceutical companies, and I'm surprised that usually you see like a Pfizer or somebody like that up here. But so again, it's usually a question about who are you selling to. So anything that's sold to consumer, it's more important to have a brand associated with it. So you will see a lot of these companies are selling something that goes direct to consumer. But as I mentioned, that trend is also changing. So you see there's a few B2B companies here that like an SAP or an IBM, or that used to be a consumer brand, but that's more of a B2B brand now, I would argue. Intel and, you know, and the likes of that, so it's the distinction between where do you see a strong brand and not is usually the B2B and the B2C kind of thing. But I would also argue that you see more of the tech kind of companies, either automotive, the software, and or things that are related to consumer goods, like you know, luxury goods, even cars. I would argue kind of fall into two buckets like that. That we see more brands as opposed to things like life sciences or materials or manufacturing or things like that. That you see less of a branding strategy. And a lot of that is changing. I would argue that creating a brand is important, even if you're in a B2B space. So it's not necessarily the case that you should care about that.
Understood. And about the bankruptcy cases, I don't know if you have any.
Okay. Oh yeah. Sure. So there's been so like we saw Harris, for example. That example is that's a company that's going into bankruptcy in the U.S. Unless you're completely liquidating and selling everything in a fire sale, you go into something called Chapter 11, which is a reorganization. You are technically bankrupt, but you're trying to work a plan with your creditors so that you can emerge from bankruptcy, pay some of your debt, work on the strong assets. And a lot of times you see in bankruptcy plans, you see the brand as being a big part of the plan, or intangible assets in general, because these are a lot of assets that survive bankruptcy as opposed to some of the tangible assets that don't always have a value. So you can have a product that nobody wants, but you can have a strong brand. And we see these examples all the time, and some of the more noticeable examples of, so what we see is we see brands being acquired out of bankruptcy also. And things like Converse, for example, the shoe, that brand has been acquired out of bankruptcy by Nike. GM went through bankruptcy and emerged with a strong brand from that, but they were bailed out by the government, so that's another situation. Toys R Us was one of the latest examples of a brand that went through bankruptcy and got acquired, and the whole. I don't think that they're going to open stores again, but somebody bought the brand, and they're going to use it to rebrand toys in a different way. So the brand can sometimes survive even though the product or the company don't survive. So
Understood. Meanwhile, I see that there is a question in the chat window. Maybe you may want to take a look. It's from guest
let me
132.
see. Okay. Hi, guest 132. So with brand value contributing for larger and larger percentage of enterprise value, do you think that accounting principles need to be adjusted to better capture brand values? If so, how? Okay. We're not going to win that battle. So the accounting rules, and there's been a lot of attempts over the year to realign, and the problem is bigger than just the brand. The entire category of intangible assets is largely not represented as an asset on the books of the companies that created them. You only show an intangible asset if you buy a company that's holding an intangible asset, and then you go through something called the purchase price allocation. You take the price of the acquisition and you distribute it among the various assets, including the intangible assets. So if you go on the Apple balance sheet, which is a slide I had but I took out at the last minute, and you look at intangibles on the Apple balance sheet, you're going to see very little. And what you're going to see there is only things that they acquired, not the Apple brand. The Apple brand is not going to be there. The Coke brand is not going to be there. Any of these brands that you see here, if somebody buys Coke tomorrow, then they're going to show the brand. But Coke itself does not show the brand. So there's really nothing we can do about that. It's not going to be adjusted. There has been multiple task forces over the years, both US GAAP and IFRS, which is the international standard that apply in Europe and I believe in Japan also. It is what it is. So we have to, when you look at the balance sheet, you have to keep in mind that the intangibles are not on the balance sheet, and then which going to give companies like mine something to do. If it's important for you to value either your brand or a brand that you're investing in or some other brand, then you can engage in a valuation exercise. That's really the only way. You can look at Interbrand. If you believe their methodology, which you're not going to know, they're not going to tell you, but they have their own methodology. You're going to only see the top brand. If you want to value a brand that's not in the top 100 globally, then you have to engage in a valuation exercise. And that's why I also provided the standard, which is going to be helpful in walking you through the exercise of doing that. So I can help there. Not going to happen. Okay.
Good. So perfect. So guess 132 hopefully is happy with your response, and I don't see anyone else, and we're perfectly on time because it's 10:58 here in Tokyo.
Right.
And almost 7 a.m. for you, I guess. So I would wish
Feels like the middle
to you
of the day.
a great start in Europe. Yes, a very pleasant evening, and to us in Japan, a very good night.
Thank you.
And again, I would like to thank, of course, everyone that joined us. Eva from Brussels, as usual, and Efrat for being with us. Great, valuable insights. Everything will be shared as usual, and hopefully I'll see you on July 8th. We will have another webinar together with other help desks. So other additional details will be released shortly. So thanks again, everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you. Good night and good evening.